The Lizard by Cutcliffe-Hyne. It is not expected that the general public will believe the statements which will be made in this paper. They are written to catch the eye of the Wilfred Cording, or Cordy, if he still lives, or of his friends and relations. Further details may be had from me, by any of these interested people, at Poste Restante, Wharfdale, Yorkshire. My name is Chesney, and I am sufficiently well known there for letters to be forwarded. The matters in question happened 2 years ago on the last day of August. I had a small high ground shoot near Kettlewell, but that morning dense mist made shooting out of the question. However, I wasn't sorry for an off day, as there was a newly found cave in the neighbourhood which I was anxious to explore, cave hunting being, after shooting, my main amusement. I suggested to my keeper that he should come with me to inspect the cave. He made some sort of excuse, and I did not press the matter further. The dalesmen up there look on the local caves with more awe than respect. They will not own up to believing in bogles, but I fancy their creed runs that way. I have taken unwilling helpers cave hunting with me before, and found them to be such a nuisance that I didn't press for the keeper's society. So, I took candles, matches in a bottle, some magnesium wire, a small coil of rope, and a large flask of whisky, and set off alone. I hadn't seen the cave for a week or more, and I was a good deal annoyed to find by the boot marks that quite a lot of people had visited it in the interval. However, I hoped that the larger parts were made by shepherds, and I trusted that I might find the interior still untampered with. The cave was easy enough to enter. There was a funnel-shaped slide of peat earth and mud and clay to start with, well pitted with boot marks. And there was a tumbled wall of boulders slanting inwards, down which I crawled face uppermost till the light behind me dwindled. The way was getting pretty murky, so I lit up a candle to avoid accidents, stepped knee-deep into a lively stream of water, and went briskly ahead. It was an ordinary enough limestone cave so far, with inferior stalactites and a good deal of wet everywhere. It did not appear to have been disturbed, and I stepped along cheerfully. Presently, I got a bit of a shock. The roof above began to droop downwards, slowly but relentlessly. It seemed as though my way was soon going to be blocked. However, the water beneath deepened, and so I waded along as far as possible. It was a cold job. The water was up to my chin, and the air was none of the best. I was beginning to think that I had got wet through for no adequate reason. But there was no accounting for the freaks of caves. Just when I fancied I was at the end of my tether, I was able to stand erect once more. A dozen yards further on, I came out onto dry rock and was able to have a rest and a drop of whisky. The roof had quite disappeared to the candlelight overhead, so I burned a foot of magnesium wire for a better inspection. It was really a magnificent cave, well furnished with stalactites above and stalagmites below. The candle burned brightly, showing me that the air was healthy enough. And yet, the air in this cave did not altogether pass muster. There was something new about it, and anything new in cave smells is always suspicious. It wasn't the smell of peat, or iron, or sandstone, or fungus. It was a faint musky smell, rather sickly. When I inhaled a deeper breath of it, it came very near to making my flesh creep. Before me stretched a tarn of black water, with a beach of white tumbled limestone on the far side. I pitched a stone into the water, shattering the surface for the first time in a million years. Yes, it's worth doing even a year of cave hunting to do a thing like that. The stone sank with a luscious plop. The water was clearly very deep. But I was wet to the neck already and didn't mind a swim. So, with a lump of clay, I stuck one candle in my cap, set up a couple more on the dry rock as a lighthouse to guide my return, lowered myself into the black water, and struck out. The smell of musk oppressed me, and I fancied it was growing stronger. So I didn't dawdle. Roughly, I guessed the pool to be some 35 yards across. I landed amongst the broken limestone with a shiver and a scramble. The smell of musk was strong enough now to make me cough. But when I had stood up and got the candle into my hand again, a thrill came through me, as I thought I guessed the cause. 12 yards further on was a broken cast, where some monstrous uncouth animal had been entombed in the forgotten ages of the past, and mouldered away and left only the outer shell of its form and shape. For ages this too had endured. Indeed, it had been violated only by the eroding touch of the water and some earth tremor within the last few days. A workman with plaster of Paris could have made an exact model of this beast, which had been lost to the world's knowledge for so many weary millions of years. It had been some sort of lizard or crocodile, and in fancy I was beginning to picture its restored shape in the National Museum, when my eye fell on something amongst the rubble, which brought me to earth with a jar. I stopped and picked it up. It was a common white-handled penknife, of the variety sold by stationers for a shilling. On one side of it was the name of Wilfred Cording, or Cordy, scratched apparently with a nail. The work was neat enough to start with, but the engraver had wearied of his job, till the surname was too scratchy to be certain about. On the hot impulse of the moment, I threw the knife far from me, into the black water, and swore. It is more than a little unpleasant for an explorer to find that he had been forestalled. But since then, I have more than once regretted the hard things I said against Cording, if that is his name. If the man is alive, I apologise to him. If, as I strongly suspect, he came to a horrible end in that cave, I tender my regrets to his relatives. I looked upon the cast of the saurian now, with the warmth of discovery quite gone. I was conscious of cold, and the musky smell was growing more and more unpleasant. I think I should straight away have gone back to daylight and a change of clothes, if I hadn't thought that I could see the outline of another cast. It was hazy, as a thing of the kind would be if seen through the medium of sparsely transparent limestone, and by the light of a solitary paraffin wax candle, I kicked at it petulantly. Some flakes of stone shelled off, and I distinctly heard a more extensive crack. I kicked harder, with all my might in fact. More flakes shelled away, and there was a little volley of cracks. It did not feel like kicking against stone. It was like kicking against something that gave, and I could have sworn that the musky smell increased. I felt a curious glow coming over me that was part fright, part excitement, part nausea, but plucked up my courage and kicked again and again. The limestone flew up in tinkling showers. There was no doubt now about there being something springy underneath, and that it was the dead carcass of another lizard I hadn't doubt. Here was luck, here was a find. Here was I the discoverer of the body of a prehistoric beast preserved in the limestone down through all the ages, just as mammoths have been preserved in Siberian ice. As I kicked and battered at the harsh, scaly skin of this anachronism, which ought to have buried body and bones 10 million years ago, I wondered whether they would make me a baronet for the discovery. Then, of a sudden, I got a start. I could have sworn the dead flesh moved beneath me. But I shouted aloud at myself in contempt. 10 million years. It was impossible. And then I got a further start, a more solid one. While I was raising a boulder for a further blow, a splinter of stone broke away as if pressed up from below, flipped up in the air. My blood chilled, and for a moment, the loneliness of that unknown cave oppressed me. But I told myself that I was an old hand, that this was childishness. I continued my battering until a further movement left me in no possible doubt. The beast was actually stirring of its own accord. Stirring and alive. It was writhing and straining to leave the rocky bed where it had lain quiet through all those countless cycles of time, and I watched it in a very petrification of terror. Its efforts threw up whole basketfuls of splintered stone at a time. I could see the muscles of its back ripple at each effort. I could see the exposed part of its body grow in size every time it wrenched at the walls of that semi-eternal prison. Then, as I looked, it doubled up its back like a bucking horse, and drew out its stumpy head and long feelers, giving out the while a thin, small scream like a hurt child. And then, with another effort, it pulled out its long tail and stood upon the debris of the limestone, panting with a newfound life. I gazed upon it with a sickly fascination. Its body was about the bigness of 2 horses. Its head was curiously short, but the mouth opened back almost to the forearm, and sprouting from the nose were 2 enormous feelers, each at least 6 feet long, tipped with fleshy tendrils like fingers that opened and shut tremulously. In colour it was a bright grass green, and worst of all was the musky smell. All this while I had stood motionless, but the beast must have heard some slight movement. I could not see any ears, but it heard me, no doubt of that. Worse, it hobbled around clumsily of its jointless legs and waved its feelers in my direction. I could not make out any eyes. Its sensitiveness seemed to lie in those fathom-long feelers, and in the fleshy fingers which twitched at the end of them. Then it opened its great jaws and yawned cavernously, and came towards me. It seemed to have no trace of fear or hesitation. It hobbled clumsily on, exhibiting its monstrous deformity in every movement, and preceded always by those hateful feelers. For a while I stayed in my place, too paralysed of horror at this awful thing I had dragged up from the forgotten dead. But then one of its feelers touched me, and the fleshy fingers pawed my face. I leapt into movement again. The beast was hungry after its fast of 10 million years. I turned and ran. It followed me. In the feeble light of the one solitary candle I could see it hobbling, and hobbling faster and less clumsily now, as it worked the rust of ages out of its cankered joints. Presently it was following me with a speed equal to my own. If the huge beast had shown anger, eagerness, any feelings, it would have been less horrible, but it was absolutely unemotional in its hunt, and this in turn came near to making me feel that I was lost, that I should surrender myself to the inevitable. I wondered dully whether there had been another beast entombed beside it, and whether that had eaten up the man who owned the penknife. But that thought suggested an idea to me. I had a stout knife in my own pocket, and I drew it out and turned to defend myself just as the feelers, with their fringe of fumbling fingers, were agonizingly close to me. I slashed at them viciously, and felt my knife grate against their armour. I might as well have hacked at an iron rail. Still, the attempt did do me good. There is an animal love of fighting stowed away in the bottom of us all somewhere, and mine woke then. I don't know that I expected to win, but I did intend to do the largest possible amount of damage before I was caught. I made a rush, stepped with 1 foot on the beast's creeping back, and leapt astern of him. The beast gave its thin, small, whistling scream, and turned quickly in chase. We doubled, turned, sprawled, leapt among the slimy boulders, and every time we came to close quarters I stabbed with my knife, though without ever finding a joint in its armour. It was clear that this could not go on. The beast grew in strength and activity, and probably in dumb anger, though it gave no sign of it. But I, meanwhile, was growing more blown, more bruised, more exhausted every moment. At last, I tripped and fell. The beast, with its clumsy waddle, shot past me before it could pull up, and in desperation I threw one arm up to drive the knife with the full force of my body into the underneath part of its body. That woke it at last. It writhed, and it plunged, and it bucked, with a frenzy that I had never seen before, and its scream grew in piercingness till it was as strong as the whistle of a steam engine. Again and again I planted my vicious blows, until it shook itself free in desperation and set off at its hobbling gait directly for the water. It plunged in, swam briskly with its tail. Then I saw it dive and disappear for good. And what next? I took to the water too, and swam as I had never swum before. It was that or nothing. Risk the swim or stay and be eaten. How I got across, I do not know. How I landed, I do not know. How I got down the windings of that cave is more than I can say, and whether the beast followed me, I do not know either. Somehow, I got to daylight again, staggering like a drunken man. I struggled as far as the village, noting how the people ran from me. At the inn, the landlord cried out as though I had been the plague. It seemed that the musky smell I had brought with me was unendurable, though, by this time, the mere detail of a smell was far beneath my notice. But I had stripped of my stinking clothes, and washed and put to bed. And a doctor came and gave me an opiate, and when, 12 hours later, wakefulness came to me again, I had the sense to hold my tongue. All the village wanted to know where the smell came from. I said I must have fallen into something. And there the matter ends for the moment. I go no more cave hunting, and I offer no help to those who do. But if the man who owns that white-handled penknife is alive, I should like to compare experiences with him.